Hi, this is Dr. Tochi, and I'm continuing my series on Jesus Egregore. If you are unfamiliar with what an egregore is or what the Jesus Egregore is, I encourage you to go to the beginning of this series. You will find it on the platform here where you're watching this video and also on my YouTube channel, Dr. Tochi. So after we recognize the hold of the Jesus egregore on our lives, we need to now start seeing the cracks in the system that this egregore has created. No egregore lasts forever. An egregore depends on devotion and energy that comes from emotions. When we look at the history of the Jesus egregore, we can see periods when it ascended, when it faltered, when it remained even, and then when it changed, how strongly it had its influence over humankind. We can also see that these peaks and valleys were influenced by alternative religions and alternative beliefs that people had. So, understanding the cracks in the system is quite empowering and important because it shows that the power of the egregore is not absolute. It depends on millions of people giving it attention, obedience, fear, and hope. That's what it needs to survive. So when these streams of energy begin to falter or decrease or diminish, then the strength of this egregore starts weakening and the egregore itself starts to fracture, and then its influence over nations and communities and people begins to diminish greatly. So now let me refer to some notes I made from my research into this topic. Now, when we look at the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, figures like Martin Luther challenged the Catholic Church's monopoly on the interpretation of Christianity and the interpretation of the Bible. Okay, so the translation of the Bible into vernacular languages, that is, into people's different languages, began to weaken the egregore's hold over knowledge. Because remember, people back in the day were illiterate and they depended on other people's interpretations of the Bible, especially those of the ruling powers of the church. So now having the Bible translated to different languages around the world enabled people, and also the increase in education, I would say, the literacy rate, enabled people to start reading things for themselves and really understanding what Christianity was all about. So what happened was people could now interact with these scriptures directly and outside of intermediaries, and the egregore's hold on the people's minds began to weaken. Now, another thing that really started showing the cracks of the Jesus egregore was scientific discovery and philosophic thoughts, which questioned the Christian dogma. Okay, when people started to reason and to observe the natural world, okay, a lot of blind obedience began to be lost because people started thinking and saying, oh, when this happens, that happens. This cause results in this effect. And so superstitions started to die. Things that people used to believe in about the Jesus egregore or even about Jesus the historical man began to diminish. Okay, one of those superstitions was that really began to die was if you burn the Bible that you will die within 21 days. And people began to see that little things like that were not true. Another thing that started bringing and showing the cracks in the Jesus egregore was colonial resistance. So when there were movements against colonialism in places like Africa, Asia, and the Americas, indigenous communities resisted missionaries and colonial impositions. People started returning to the religions of their ancestors, okay, and started returning to their ancestral practices. And even when indigenous peoples were forced to accept Christianity, secret rituals, secret languages, and cultural practices persisted, and this also served to weaken the egregore's hold over people. And that is why in many places in Africa, in Asia, you will see people actually practicing Christianity side by side by their traditional religions. And when someone has a problem, they will be trying, okay, let me see if the Jesus Christianity will solve it. If it doesn't solve it, they'll switch right back to their traditional religions. And even this happens today in the villages of Europe. Okay, and you will also see that in the history of Europe, when they were praying and fasting and doing a lot of things, and those were not bringing the solutions they wanted, a lot of them would fall back to their traditional, okay, ancestral European religions. Another thing that is really showing the cracks in the Jesus egregore is that in the 20th century and the 21st century, where we are today, millions of people are leaving organized religion. So it's not just Christianity they're leaving other major religions, okay? Social media, global communication, and the access to diverse spiritual practices are reducing the fear-based control that the Jesus egregore has had over people. So people can go on social media, okay, even like this one where you're watching me now, and they'll see how other people are doing things around the world, and then they can pick and choose what works for them. Or they can say, you know what, I'm going to go back to my ancestral practices because this method of solving problems with the weeping and the crying and the fasting and the penitence is not working for me. So that is to say that the Jesus egregore, it still exists, but its feeding sources have diminished greatly, okay? Then another thing that has shown cracks in the Jesus egregore have been scandals, especially scandals within the church and within churches, okay? Abuse, corruption, financial malfeasance, and a whole bunch of things, just drama and conflict has shown that the hold of the egregore is really breaking down. And many who have given full devotion to this thing have withdrawn. They're questioning authority. They're questioning what they're seeing and what they're observing, and they're reclaiming their energy. And since the egregore's power depends on trust and blind obedience and fear, when these things break, its structures weaken. So these examples show a pattern. Wherever devotion falters, critical thought rises, or cultural memory resists, the egregore develops cracks, and its influence is never permanent, okay? It's only sustained by energy, fear, and obedience. Recognizing these cracks allows us to see that liberation is possible, both personally and collectively. So here's an exercise you can do to help you observe these cracks and take advantage of these cracks. Sit in meditation. Visualize the Jesus egregore as this vast ancient structure, okay? Imagine seeing fractures and cracks in its walls, cracks along its towers, and pieces of stone falling away from it. Speak aloud. I see the cracks. I'm no longer compelled to feed what is breaking. Okay? Then feel yourself stepping outside of the shadow of the structure, and you're breathing freely and feeling free. And here's a journal prompt for you. Where have I seen evidence that the hold of the Jesus egregore is weakening in the world? How does this empower me to reclaim my energy and my sovereignty? So be sure to do the ritual and the journal prompting and watch how your life will transform and become free from this egregore. Remember, you can always get me at my website at tochi.us or drtochi.com.